The prairie stretched endlessly, its golden grasses swaying beneath a restless wind. Emily clutched the folds of her torn skirt as she stumbled forward, each step heavier than the last. Hours ago, her world had shattered, the wagon train ambushed by raiders, screams filling the air, smoke rising like a black curse against the wide sky. Somehow she had escaped. Somehow her feet had carried her far from the chaos. But now, alone beneath the burning sun, she felt more like prey than survivor. Every sound unnerved her, the cry of a hawk overhead, the rustle of unseen creatures in the grass. The open plains no longer seemed full of promise as they once had when she left Missouri with her family. Now they were vast, merciless, and foreign. She whispered prayers under her breath, clutching at the locket her mother had given her. Her dry lips parted in a gasp when she noticed movement on the horizon. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then the figure grew clearer, a rider astride a horse, swift and certain in his approach. Her heart leapt into her throat. Raiders again? Or something worse? She turned, half running, half stumbling, but exhaustion betrayed her. By the time she risked a glance back, the rider was nearly upon her. The horse, a sleek and powerful animal with a coat the color of storm clouds, halted abruptly, kicking up a spray of dust. Emily froze. Before her towered a man unlike any she had ever seen, tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair bound with a strip of leather, a bow slung across his back. His eyes were sharp, the color of flint, and they pierced her with an intensity that rooted her to the ground. His chest rose and fell steadily beneath his buckskin shirt, and though he said nothing at first, his very presence commanded her silence. Then his voice cut through the wind, deep and edged with authority. "Inside now." The words rang out like a whip crack. Emily flinched, trembling as though she had been struck. Inside? Inside where? She followed the direction of his gaze and spotted a small structure. Half hidden against the slope of a nearby hill, a lodge of hide and poles. Her heart thundered. She should run. She should resist. Everything she had been told warned her of men like him. Yet, something in his tone, forceful, urgent, protective, stayed her feet. When she didn't move, the warrior dismounted in one swift motion. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. Emily tried to steady her breath, but it came out in sharp, uneven bursts. He was too near, too overwhelming, and yet she could not look away. The strength in his movements, the calm certainty in his eyes, stirred something within her she could neither name nor suppress. Her fear tangled with the strange pull of fascination. He was dangerous, yes, but not with the cruelty she had witnessed from the raiders. His danger was different, rooted in a power that was both physical and unyielding, yet threaded with an unspoken promise of protection. "Go," he barked again, motioning toward the lodge. His jaw tightened, eyes flickering briefly to the open prairie behind her. As if he sensed threats she could not see. Emily swallowed hard. Her legs wavered beneath her, but at last they obeyed. She moved toward the shelter, every step filled with hesitation. The warrior walked behind her, close enough that she felt the weight of his presence, close enough that her breath quickened for reasons she dared not admit. As she crossed the threshold of the lodge, shadows fell around her, the scent of smoke and hide surrounding her senses. The Cheyenne warrior remained outside, scanning the horizon, his body taut with vigilance. Inside, Emily clutched her locket, her pulse racing. She was safe for now. Yet the question gnawed at her heart. Was she safe from him, or from herself and the dangerous desire awakening deep within? The lodge was dim, lit only by the faint glow of sunlight filtering through seams in the hide walls. Emily stood awkwardly just inside the entrance, her back pressed to the curved frame of wooden poles as if she might disappear into it. Her chest still heaved from the shock of being ordered here, her mind racing in frantic circles. The scents inside the shelter were foreign and earthy smoke. Leather, herbs dried and hung in bunches along the poles. A blanket woven in dark colors lay folded in the corner, alongside a small pouch and tools she couldn't name. Everything in the space spoke of another life, another world, one she had been taught to fear. Behind her, she heard the horse snort softly, then the heavy tread of boots on earth. The warrior ducked his head as he entered, and suddenly the small lodge seemed even smaller. His presence filled it, pressing against her nerves. He moved with controlled strength, every step purposeful, as though the ground itself yielded to him. Emily forced herself to meet his eyes, though her breath caught when she did. They were dark and unreadable, reflecting fire she could not name. He studied her for a moment, her torn dress, her scraped hands, her trembling frame before turning away, crouching near a small fire pit at the center of the lodge. He began to stir the ashes, coaxing faint embers back to life. She almost felt relief that his attention shifted, though confusion swirled just as strongly. Who was he? Why had he brought her here? He could have left her on the prairie as vulnerable prey for raiders or wolves. Yet he hadn't. That fact gnawed at her. Both unsettling and strangely comforting. At last, he spoke, his tone clipped but not unkind. "You stay here, safe." The words were simple, but his voice carried weight, leaving no room for argument. Emily bristled anyway, her pride sparking against the authority in his tone. I don't need your orders," she stammered, though her voice lacked conviction. "I should be finding my family, not hiding in." Her words faltered as his gaze lifted to hers again. There was no anger in his eyes, only certainty. He shook his head slowly, firmly. "Outside danger." "You stay." Emily's throat tightened. He didn't shout, but his command was unshakable, his certainty more powerful than any raised voice. She turned her face away, blinking back frustrated tears. Who was he to decide what she should do? And yet, deep inside, she knew she was too exhausted, too broken to argue. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not empty. She watched him from the corner of her eye as he worked with calm efficiency, placing small sticks into the rekindled fire, setting a pot over it, his hands steady and practiced. Each movement revealed a discipline she had never seen in the men she'd known. Her stomach growled unexpectedly, breaking the stillness. Emily flushed with embarrassment, but the warrior only glanced at her briefly before reaching into a pouch. He tore a piece of dried meat and extended it toward her. Emily hesitated. She had never accepted food from anyone outside her world, and yet hunger gnawed at her resolve. Slowly, with a hand that trembled despite her best effort, she took it. Their fingers brushed for the briefest moment, and a shock ran through her body. Fear. Yes, but also something startlingly alive. She bit into the food, forcing herself to chew. Her gaze flicked to him again, studying his strong profile, the proud line of his jaw, the way he seemed more part of this wilderness than any man could be. He hadn't harmed her. He had given her shelter, food, even safety. Still, her heart beat wildly, torn between gratitude and the instinct to flee. The fire crackled softly, filling the silence neither seemed ready to break. Yet unspoken questions swirled thickly between them. Why had he brought her here, and what did he intend to do with her? Emily wrapped her arms around herself, retreating deeper into the lodge's shadows. The Cheyenne warrior glanced at her once more, his eyes lingering with something she could not read. For reasons she dared not admit, she felt both safer and more unsettled than she had in her entire life. The following morning, Emily awoke to the crackle of firewood and the faint aroma of something cooking. For a moment, she lay still, disoriented, until the memory of the previous day crashed over her, the ambush, the rider, the commanding voice that had left her trembling. Her gaze darted around the lodge, settling on the warrior crouched near the fire, turning a strip of meat with a carved stick. Dakota. she had overheard. His name in fragments when another voice outside had called to him briefly in the night before fading back into the darkness. The name suited him, strong, edged with mystery. Rooted in a world far from her own, Emily pushed herself upright, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The lodge felt stifling, filled with scents and textures unfamiliar to her senses. She longed for her mother's cooking, for the sound of her father's steady voice, for the company of people who spoke her tongue and understood her world. But all she had was him. He glanced at her as she stirred, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he broke a piece of the roasted meat and extended it to her. Emily stiffened. A dozen warnings from childhood rose in her mind. Tales whispered about the dangers of savages, how they could not be trusted, how they were enemies to all decent settlers. She wanted to refuse out of pride and principle, but her empty stomach betrayed her. She took the food reluctantly, mumbling, "Thank you," though she doubted he understood. Still, his eyes softened slightly at the sound of her voice, as if recognizing its tone, if not its meaning. He gestured toward her ankle, swollen from the frantic run across the prairie. When she tried to protest, he shook his head firmly and reached for a bundle of herbs. Emily bristled, instinctively drawing back. "I can take care of myself," she muttered. He did not understand her words, but he understood her resistance. His lips pressed into a thin line, and he said something sharp in his own tongue, his tone stern. The sound made her pulse quicken. It wasn't anger exactly. It was command, the same authority with which he had ordered her into the lodge. He reached for her ankle again, slower this time, giving her the chance to pull away. Emily hesitated, pride warring with reason. Finally, she allowed his hand to close gently around her leg. His touch was surprisingly careful, his fingers steady as he examined the swelling. He crushed the herbs into a paste and applied them with deliberate movements, binding the ankle with a strip of cloth. She watched him in silence, confusion swirling inside her. How could he be both the frightening warrior who had barked orders and the man who now handled her injury with such care? When he finished, he looked up, their eyes locking. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Emily's breath caught. She felt exposed under his gaze, as though he saw through her layers of fear and defiance. She looked away quickly, cheeks burning. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken tension. At last Emily spoke, more to herself than to him. "I don't belong here." The words meant nothing to him, yet he seemed to understand the sentiment. His brow furrowed, and he replied in his own language, his voice calm but resolute. The syllables rolled like distant thunder, rich and grounding. Though she could not grasp their meaning, his tone left no doubt. He believed she did belong here for now. Frustration pricked at her. How could they ever understand one another when every word was a barrier? How could she ever trust a man whose people she had been raised to fear? And yet, a whisper of doubt slid beneath her certainty. Perhaps the stories she had been told were not the whole truth. Dakota moved back to the fire, giving her space. Emily pressed her hands into her lap, torn between relief and disappointment. Their worlds clashed at every turn, yet within that clash, something fragile and unexpected was beginning to take root. The days bled together in the shelter of the lodge, each one stretching long with silence and unspoken tension. Emily counted the hours by the shifting light through the hide walls and by the rhythmic routines of the Cheyenne warrior, who had become her reluctant guardian. Dakota rose with the dawn, leaving briefly on his horse, returning with food or firewood, always watchful, always silent. At first, Emily told herself she was only biding time, waiting for a chance to escape, to find her people, to return to the life she knew. But each attempt at planning an escape withered before it could take shape. The prairie was vast, dangerous, and merciless. She remembered the raiders' shouts, the terror of the attack. Alone, she would not survive. And so she stayed. But staying did not mean submitting quietly. Every interaction between her and Dakota felt like a battle. One fought not with weapons, but with glances, tones, and stubborn silences. One evening, as the fire crackled low, Emily dared to voice her frustration aloud. "You can't keep me here forever," she said, her voice tight, hands clenched in her lap. Dakota, seated cross-legged by the fire, glanced up from the knife he was sharpening. He didn't understand all her words, but he caught the sharpness in her tone, the defiance in her eyes. Slowly, he shook his head and pointed toward the lodge walls, then out toward the prairie beyond. "Danger," he said simply. Emily's chest tightened. That word, one of the few he spoke often in her tongue, was both a warning and a prison. She wanted to scream that he was the danger, that his presence kept her heart thundering and her thoughts tangled. Instead, she pressed back tears of frustration. "You don't get to decide my life," Dakota frowned, not grasping her meaning. Still, he rose, towering over her, his shadow falling across her as the firelight flickered. For a moment, fear shot through her again, sharp and unyielding. But instead of menace, his eyes carried something else: conviction, a kind of fierce protectiveness that left her breathless. "Stay," he commanded again, softer this time, almost pleading beneath the firmness. Emily swallowed hard, her chest aching with conflicting emotions. She wanted to hate him for keeping her here, wanted to scream at his stubborn dominance. Yet beneath it all, a small, treacherous part of her felt safe. Safe in his presence, safe under the strength he embodied. That realization unsettled her more than anything. The following night, a storm rolled over the plains, wind shrieking against the lodge, rain beating down in sheets. The thunder rattled Emily to her bones, dragging forth memories of the raid screams drowned by fire and smoke, the pounding of hooves. She pressed her hands over her ears, but the storm roared too loudly. Dakota noticed her trembling. Without a word, he crossed the lodge and crouched near her. His hand hovered for a moment, uncertain, before settling lightly on her shoulder. Emily stiffened, then slowly let her hands drop. The warmth of his touch anchored her, steadying her breaths. They sat like that for a long while, the storm raging outside, silence settling between them inside. Emily hated the comfort she found in his presence. She hated that her body relaxed under his hand, that her fear quieted with him near. She hated most of all the way her heart leapt when their eyes met through the dim fire elight. She turned away quickly, whispering to herself, "I can't feel this." "I won't." But the truth pressed close, undeniable. Every day in his company tangled her emotions further. Fear was no longer clean and sharp, it was braided with something softer, something dangerous. An unwanted bond was growing, one she could not name, yet one she could no longer deny. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the damp earth and in Emily's unsettled heart. For 2 days the world beyond the lodge seemed washed clean, the prairie gleaming under a fresh, bright sky. Yet inside the shelter, the air felt heavier, thick with something neither she nor Dakota dared to name. Emily found herself watching him more than she should. When he crouched by the fire, his movements precise and strong. When he tended his weapons, his hands steady, his brow furrowed in focus. He carried himself like the prairie itself, unyielding, vast, rooted in strength. She tried to look away whenever their gazes met, but the memory of his hand on her shoulder during the storm lingered like a warmth she could not shake. One evening, the rain began again, not with the violence of the storm, but with a steady, soothing rhythm that drummed against the hide walls. The fire crackled softly. Emily sat wrapped in a blanket near the hearth, her ankle still bound though healing, her heart restless. Dakota was across from her, silently working a strip of leather into braided cord. The silence weighed on her. She wanted to fill it, to push back against the strange comfort that was settling between them. And yet, against her better judgment, Her voice slipped into the stillness. "Do you have a family?" she asked quietly. Dakota's head lifted, his eyes narrowing as if to catch her meaning. She gestured awkwardly, two hands pressed together, then pulled apart. "Family," she repeated. Recognition dawned. His gaze dropped, shadow passing over his features. After a long pause, he touched his chest lightly, then held up two fingers before letting his hand fall to his side. His lips pressed into a firm line. Emily's breath caught. Two? She didn't know if he meant siblings, children, parents, but the grief in his eyes told her enough. They were gone. Her throat tightened with guilt. She had been raised to believe men like him were her enemy. But in that moment, he was simply a man carrying loss not so different from herself. Her eyes stung, and before she could stop herself, she whispered, "I lost mine too." He couldn't understand the words, but perhaps he felt the tremor in her voice. His dark eyes lingered on her face, searching, as though he could see the ghosts hovering behind her. Something in her cracked then. The memory of the raid returned with vivid force, the screaming, the fire, the sight of her father falling from the wagon. She pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Dakota's cord slipped from his hands. He leaned forward, his movements slow, deliberate, as though approaching a skittish animal. For a moment, he only sat near her, close enough that she felt the heat of his body, the quiet strength radiating from him. Then, hesitantly, he touched her hand where it clutched the blanket. Emily froze. His touch was not commanding this time, not forceful. It was gentle, almost tentative. She lifted her gaze to him, her vision blurred by tears. Their eyes locked, and in that gaze, the barriers of language and culture seemed to thin. She saw not a warrior, not an enemy, but a man with grief as deep as her own. A man whose losses had carved the same hollows in his heart. Her breath trembled. She should have pulled away. Instead, she let his hand rest on hers, their fingers almost interlacing. The fire snapped softly, the rain whispered on the hides, and for the first time, the silence between them did not feel heavy. It felt like understanding. They spoke little that night, her words meaningless to him, his syllables foreign to her, but their eyes said enough. In their shared vulnerabilities, something fragile began to grow, something neither fear nor defiance could fully bury. Emily lay down later with her heart racing, staring into the dim shadows of the lodge. She knew she was crossing a dangerous threshold, one that could not be undone. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt a dangerous pull, stronger than fear itself. The fragile peace that had begun to weave itself between Emily and Dakota did not last long. Out on the prairie, danger never truly slept out. It began with the distant echo of hooves. At first, Emily thought it was only the thrum of thunder returning, but the ground itself seemed to tremble. Dakota stiffened instantly, his head snapping toward the sound. He rose in one fluid motion, bow in hand, his body suddenly taut like a drawn string. Emily's heart lurched. She had seen that look in his eyes before, the sharp alertness, the readiness for battle. She followed his gaze, but the hides of the lodge blocked her view. He barked something in his tongue short, urgent. His hand shot toward her in a motion she had come to recognize. "Stay." Emily's throat tightened. "What is it?" she whispered, even though she knew he wouldn't answer in words she could understand. Dakota didn't waste time. He reached for his quiver, slung it across his back, and in the next breath he was gone, slipping out into the fading light like a shadow born of the earth itself. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of the blanket around her. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer. Shouts followed rough voices, men's laughter, the crack of a whip. Her stomach turned to ice. She knew those voices. Raiders. She crouched low, pressing her body against the wall of the lodge. Every muscle in her screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. Her breath came fast, uneven. Outside, she heard the shrill cry of Dakota's horse, followed by the deep, chilling roar of a man's voice. Dakota's. Then chaos. The sharp twang of a bowstring, the thud of hooves, the crash of bodies colliding. Shouts turned to cries of pain. Emily's entire body shook. She clamped her hands over her ears, but the sounds forced their way in. The clash of struggle, the guttural sound of men fighting for life. And through it all, Dakota's voice rang out not in fear, but in power, fierce and unyielding, moments dragged into eternities. She wanted to stay hidden, but something inside her refused to cower. Inch by inch, she crept toward the lodge entrance, pushing the flap open just enough to see. The sight stole her breath. Dakota moved like a storm unleashed. His bow fired with precision, arrows striking true even as raiders charged on horseback. When one lunged close, Dakota pivoted, using the bow as a staff to strike the man from his saddle. His strength was staggering, his presence towering even against overwhelming numbers. But what struck Emily most was not the violence, it was the way he fought. Every movement was guided by more than instinct. It was guided by something greater. He was protecting the lodge. Protecting her. Her heart hammered painfully. She should have felt only fear at the sight of blood, of men collapsing under his hand. Instead, her chest swelled with something she could not explain. Admiration. Awe, and beneath it all, a pull so dangerous it left her trembling. The skirmish was brutal but brief. The raiders, caught off guard by Dakota's ferocity, fled into the prairie, their shouts fading into the night. Silence fell, broken only by the heavy panting of Dakota's breath. Emily pushed the flap wider, her voice barely a whisper. "Dakota." He turned toward her, chest heaving, a smear of blood across his cheek, some his, most not. His eyes locked on hers, fierce but softened in relief at the sight of her unharmed. For a heartbeat, the world still. Emily stumbled out of the lodge, her legs weak, but her gaze never leaving him. She wanted to run to him, to thank him, till she stopped the thought before it could fully form. Fear tangled with desire, pulling her in two directions at once. Dakota wiped his blade, his jaw tight, then stepped toward her. The night wind whipped around them, carrying the smell of blood and earth. She met his eyes, her voice trembling. "You saved me." He did not answer in words, only dipped his head slightly, as though acknowledging what needed no explanation. And in that silence, Emily realized her fear of him was no longer clean. It was laced with something far more dangerous, something that made her chest ache and her breath quicken whenever his eyes found hers. The prairie was quiet again, but the quiet felt deceptive, like a bowstring pulled taut and waiting to snap. Dakota had driven off the raiders, yet their presence still haunted the edges of Emily's mind. She sat by the fire that night, her knees drawn to her chest, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. Dakota moved around the lodge in silence, tending to his weapons, checking the bindings on his arrows. His body bore scratches and bruises, though he had not made a sound of complaint. Emily's eyes strayed to him against her will, tracing the line of his shoulders, the strength in his arms. She hated herself for a doubt at last. The weight of everything inside her broke loose. "Why are you doing this?" She burst out, her voice raw. "Why me? Why keep me here?" Dakota froze. He looked up from his work, his eyes catching the firelight. She knew he couldn't understand every word, but her tone carried enough to strike him. Slowly, he set his bow aside and straightened, meeting her gaze. "Safe," he said simply. Emily let out a bitter laugh, though it wavered at the edges. "Safe? You don't understand. Keeping me here isn't safety, it's prison." Her voice cracked. Tears stung her eyes, unbidden. She hated how weak she sounded, how much her heart trembled even as her words tried to bite. Dakota stepped closer, his brows furrowed. He crouched in front of her, close enough that she felt the heat radiating from him, close enough that her heart thudded painfully. "You go," he said, pointing toward the flap of the lodge. His hand swept wide, toward the dark prairie. Then he shook his head firmly. "Die." The words slammed into her. They were blunt, but there was no cruelty in them, only truth. His hand returned to his chest, then pressed lightly to hers, just over her heart. "Stay." Emily's breath caught at the contact. His touch burned through the fabric of her dress, steady, commanding, and yet unbearably gentle. She stared at him, her lips parting in shock. Her body trembled. "You can't. You can't touch me like that," she whispered, though she made no move to pull away. Dakota's eyes darkened. He drew his hand back slowly, as though restraining something within himself. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, taut with unspoken things. Emily shook her head, pressing her hands to her temples. "I can't feel this. I can't want this." The words tore from her like confession. Dakota tilted his head slightly, not understanding, but his eyes never wavered from hers. They burned with the same intensity that twisted inside her chest, an intensity that frightened her more than raiders ever could. Frustration surged through her. She stood abruptly, her blanket falling to the floor. "I should hate you," she cried, her voice trembling. "You're everything I was taught to fear, everything I was told would destroy me, and yet—" Her voice broke. She couldn't finish. Dakota rose too, towering over her. His breath was uneven now, his control visibly strained. He stepped closer, close enough that the space between them felt like it could ignite. Emily's heart raced wildly, torn between the urge to flee and the urge to close the distance. Fear and desire tangled until she could no longer tell one from the other. For a long moment, neither moved. The fire cracked softly, rain pattered faintly against the hides. Then, in a voice low and rough, Dakota spoke not in English, but in his own tongue. The words were foreign, yet the yearning in them was unmistakable. Emily's chest rose and fell in sharp breaths. Tears shimmered in her eyes, though not from fear this time. She whispered, almost to herself, "What are you doing to me?" Dakota didn't answer. He only stood there, the distance between them a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point, and in that moment, Emily realized they were both caught in the same storm bound by a force neither could deny, even as it threatened to consume them both. The dawn came softly, washing the prairie in pale gold. Emily sat just outside the lodge, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. The air was crisp, the silence vast, yet inside her chest a storm still raged. She had not slept. The confrontation with Dakota the night before lingered in her mind, his hand against her heart. The fire in his eyes, the words she couldn't understand but felt deep in her bones. She had trembled not only with fear, but with something far more dangerous. Desire. And now, as the sun climbed, the question she had tried to bury pressed against her with relentless force. What was she going to do? Dakota emerged from the lodge, his presence filling the space around him as naturally as the morning light. He carried his bow slung across his back, his steps silent in the grass. When his gaze fell on her, he paused. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another. Emily's heart tightened. There was no denying the bond that had grown between them, unwanted yet undeniable. She felt it in the way her body stilled when he was near, in the strange comfort she found in his strength, in the ache that pulled her toward him despite everything. But the fear remained too. Not of him, not anymore, but of herself. Of what it would mean if she chose him, if she allowed herself to surrender to this path. It would mean abandoning the world she came from. It would mean giving up the faint hope of finding her family again. It would mean stepping into the unknown with no promise of belonging. Dakota knelt beside her, his eyes scanning her face with quiet intensity. He spoke a few words in his language, his voice low and steady. She did not understand the words, but the tone carried enough. It was a question, one weighted with something far deeper than survival. Emily's throat constricted. She wished she could answer him in his tongue. Instead, she whispered, "I don't know what to do." Her voice cracked. Tears gathered in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. She turned her face away, ashamed of her weakness. But Dakota reached out, catching her chin gently and guiding her gaze back to his. His touch was firm yet careful, a silent insistence that she not hide from him. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, the world seemed to fall away, the prairie, the fear, the ghosts of the past. There was only him, steady and unyielding, offering her something she could not name but felt with every heartbeat. Emily's breath came fast, uneven. She trembled, torn between two worlds. On one side was everything she had ever known: family, settlement, the rules of her people. On the other was Dakota, wild, fierce, dangerous, yet carrying a strength that called to her in ways she had never imagined. The decision was not made with logic, nor with certainty. It was made in the silence between heartbeats, in the warmth of his hand, in the truth that she could no longer deny the bond that had taken root between them. Slowly, she placed her hand over his, pressing it more firmly against her cheek. Her lips parted, her voice a trembling whisper. "I choose this." Dakota's eyes softened, though the fire in them did not fade. He did not speak, but his hand shifted to cradle her face more fully, his thumb brushing away her tears. Relief and something deeper passed across his features, a quiet promise without words. Emily's heart raced, but for the first time, it was not from fear. The unknown still loomed before her, vast and uncertain, but she felt herself step into it willingly. The prairie wind stirred, carrying away the remnants of doubt. Emily leaned into the warrior's touch, trembling still, but now with the knowledge that she had chosen not safety, not certainty, but the wild, dangerous desire that bound her to him. And in that choice, her world changed forever.